Did you know that a simple machine built in 1440 would lead to the downfall of the most powerful institution in Europe? The man behind it, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg, wasn't trying to start a revolution. He just wanted to print Bibles faster. But within 80 years, his printing press completely shattered the Catholic Church's thousand-year monopoly on information. It sparked the Protestant Reformation and redrew the map of Europe forever. Fast forward to 1453. The Ottoman Sultan had the most advanced communication network in the world. By 1920, that empire was gone. It wasn't destroyed by armies, but by telegraph lines that let people coordinate rebellions faster than the Sultan could ever react. Then, in 1960, the Soviet Union had total control over the information reaching 300 million people. By 1991, that control was broken, and the superpower just ceased to exist. Again, not from a military defeat, but from an information revolution. 3 massive empires, 3 new communication technologies, 3 total collapses, and they all followed the exact same 6-stage pattern. Here's the chilling part. Right now, in 2025, the United States is deep into stage 4 of that very same sequence. The internet broke the government's information monopoly, just like the printing press broke the churches. The telegraph broke the Ottomans, and television broke the Soviet Union's. What should terrify you is that every single one of these superpowers thought their control over information was permanent. They believed their official story was too sophisticated, too embedded, too big to ever be challenged. They were all wrong. The pattern is clear. Once you lose control of the narrative, you lose control of everything. Power, legitimacy, the entire empire, it all collapses within a single generation. Not slowly, but suddenly. Today, I'm going to show you this 6-stage pattern that destroyed 3 empires. You'll see how new information technology always dismantles the institutions that try to control it, and why the historical data suggests we're about 15 years away from watching the most powerful government in history learn the exact same lesson the hard way. Because information wants to be free, and when it finally breaks free, empires die. Before we dive into how these revolutions happen, you need to understand what an information monopoly really is and why it's the bedrock of all political power. An information monopoly is simply the ability to control what people know, when they learn it, and how they interpret it. For most of human history, this was easy. Information was scarce, it was expensive to copy, and it traveled slowly. So, whoever controlled the scribes, the libraries, the schools, and the messengers, they controlled reality itself. The Catholic Church perfected this system. For 1,000 years, from around 500 to 1500 AD, the Church was Europe's sole information provider. They controlled literacy. Only priests could read Latin. They controlled books. All manuscripts were painstakingly hand-copied by monks in monasteries. They controlled education. Every school was run by the Church, and they controlled interpretation. The Bible was in Latin, so ordinary people couldn't read it. They had to rely on priests to tell them what God said. This gave the Church ultimate power, not just spiritual, but political. Kings ruled by divine right, a right granted by the Church. Laws were justified by Church doctrine. Taxes were collected for Church-approved projects. Reality was whatever the Church defined it to be. If the Church said something was true, it was true. But information monopolies have a fatal weakness. They rely on scarcity. As long as information is rare and expensive, the monopoly holds strong. But the moment a new technology makes information cheap and abundant, that monopoly shatters, almost overnight. And that's exactly what happened with Gutenberg's press in 1440. Now, let me show you the 6-stage pattern. This is how an information revolution destroys every institution that attempts to control the narrative. The pattern is identical across technologies and centuries. Stage 1. Information monopoly establishment. The Church built its monopoly through what we'd now call vertical integration. They controlled every single step of the information supply chain. For production, monks hand-copied books in monastery scriptoriums. It took months to copy a single book, making them unbelievably rare and expensive. A Bible could cost as much as a house. For distribution, books stayed locked away in monastery libraries or were circulated only within the Church. There was no public book market. And finally, language control. All important texts, the Bible, legal documents, scholarly works were in Latin, a language that 99% of the population couldn't understand. This was the foundation of their power, a foundation that seemed unbreakable. We ever wonder how some systems of power last for centuries, seeming unbreakable, and then suddenly crumble? The answer, surprisingly often, comes down to one thing: control of information. Let's travel back to the year 1400. In Europe, the Church was the undisputed king of information. It ran all the schools, deciding who could learn to read, what they read, and most importantly, how to interpret it. Imagine a world with no internet, no newspapers, not even public libraries. The only places with large collections of books were monasteries. They had the resources, the time, and the skilled monks to painstakingly copy every single manuscript by hand. This created a powerful cycle. Books were rare and expensive, so very few people could read. Since literacy was rare, everyone else had to rely on priests to tell them what was written. This reliance gave the church immense authority, which in turn allowed it to control the resources needed to make more books. After nearly 1,000 years, this system seemed as permanent and natural as the sunrise. To the church leaders, it wasn't just a system, it was God's will. Information scarcity wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a feature to be maintained. Halfway across the world, the Ottoman Empire had a similar setup. The Sultan controlled all major communication networks. Official messages zipped through a state courier system. Decisions made in the palace flowed down through a rigid hierarchy of governors. Religious interpretation came from state-approved scholars, and education was handled by madrasas under the establishment's thumb. Just like the church, the Ottomans believed their system was divinely sanctioned and would last forever. And for 400 years, from 1400 to 1800, it worked flawlessly. The Sultan in Istanbul could dictate what people in Cairo or Baghdad knew. But then, a tiny invention was about to send shockwaves through these empires: the telegraph. By 1500, the church's information monopoly was at its absolute peak. The Renaissance had made it richer and more powerful than ever. Magnificent cathedrals scraped the skies, and the Pope lived like an emperor. Church lands covered a third of Europe. But with great success came great arrogance. Church leaders became convinced their power was unbreakable. They began selling indulgences, basically selling God's forgiveness for cash. They appointed corrupt officials and lived in opulence while preaching poverty. Most critically, they stopped innovating. They believed they had perfected information control. Why fix what had worked for a millennium? This is a classic trap. When information monopolists feel most secure, they become most vulnerable, because they stop adapting. The Ottomans fell into the same trap in the 1700s. Their empire was vast, stretching from Vienna to Yemen. The Sultan's word was law across 3 continents. But the leadership grew complacent, convinced of their permanent superiority. When European powers developed new military tech, new navigation techniques, and new ways of organizing government, the Ottomans dismissed them as inferior. The Sultan's information monopoly only told him what he wanted to hear, that the empire was strong. The reality was starkly different. By 1800, European powers had leaped ahead in technology, organization, and communication, but the Ottoman information system couldn't admit this, because to do so would be to admit its own failure and undermine its authority. Then, in 1440, a German inventor named Gutenberg changed the world. His printing press meant books could be produced in hours, not months. The cost of information plummeted. By the year 1500, over 20 million books had been printed in Europe, more in just 50 years than in the entire previous millennium. This explosion of print created alternative information networks, completely outside the church's control. Printers in German cities started publishing books in German, not just Latin. For the first time, people could read for themselves, without a priest as an intermediary. New ideas began to spread horizontally, from city to city, bypassing the church's top-down hierarchy. A monk named Martin Luther understood the power of this new technology immediately. In 1517, he posted his 95 Theses criticizing the church. Thanks to the printing press, his ideas went viral. Within 2 months, they were printed and distributed all over Germany. Within a year, they were being read across Europe. This was simply impossible under the old system. Luther cleverly wrote his pamphlets in simple, everyday German, attacking church practices that ordinary people could see with their own eyes, like the sale of indulgences. Printers loved him because his works sold like hotcakes. By 1520, Europe was buzzing with alternative networks, printing shops, pamphlet distributors, reading groups, and public debates. People were accessing information the church couldn't control and couldn't suppress. The monopoly was broken. The story of the church and the printing press is a powerful lesson from history that echoes even today. Information wants to be free, and those who try to control it often find themselves on the wrong side of the future. Let's talk about how empires fall. It's not always about armies and battles. Sometimes, it's about information. The Ottoman Empire, for example, ran into a big problem with a new technology, the telegraph. Starting in the 1850s, European powers built telegraph networks that completely bypassed the Ottoman communication system. Think about it. A message that once took weeks to travel via an Ottoman courier could now zip across European telegraph lines in just a few hours. This gave people within the empire access to a whole new world of information. Suddenly, nationalist movements in places like Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria could coordinate their efforts using these new telegraph networks, which the Sultan couldn't monitor or control. European newspapers, filled with news the Sultan's government hadn't approved, started reaching Ottoman cities. By the year 1900, the Ottoman information monopoly was shattered. People all over the empire had access to ideas, news, and ways to organize that were completely outside of the state's control. This brings us to what I call Stage 4, mass information leak and narrative disruption. And believe it or not, this is exactly where we are in America right now. The internet has created these alternative information networks that the government and mainstream media simply can't control. Let me show you how this has played out before. For the Catholic Church, stage 4 began when the Bible was printed in local languages. In 1522, Martin Luther published the New Testament in German. For the first time, people could read the actual words of Jesus for themselves, not just the church's interpretation. And what they found was a huge contradiction. Jesus preached poverty, but the Pope lived in a palace. Jesus said salvation was a free gift, but the church was selling indulgences. Jesus criticized wealthy religious leaders, yet the church's bishops were some of the richest men in Europe. Once people could compare the church's teachings to the actual Bible, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. The church's entire narrative collapsed. Not because enemies attacked it from the outside, but because its own source material contradicted the story it was telling. For the Ottomans, stage 4 hit when the telegraph spread information faster than the government could react. In 1876, during the Russo-Turkish War, news of Ottoman military defeats reached the cities through European telegraphs long before the Sultan's government could spin an official story. People learned the empire was losing, the economy was a mess, and the government was lying to them. The narrative of Ottoman strength and superiority just crumbled when people got access to the real, unfiltered information. Now, fast forward to today. Stage 4 is happening right now through social media, alternative news sites, and leaked documents. The government's narrative about a strong economy clashes with what people are actually experiencing. Officials say inflation is under control, but families can't afford a home. They say the economy is growing, but real wages are falling. They say the dollar is strong, but we see other countries moving away from it. The official story on foreign policy also contradicts what we see in leaked information. Officials claim wars are about spreading democracy, but documents often show they're really about resources and strategic positioning. They say sanctions are effective, but the targeted countries just find alternatives and keep going. Then there's domestic surveillance. Officials insist they respect our privacy, but leaked documents reveal mass data collection, social media monitoring, and the financial tracking of ordinary citizens. Just like the church's narrative fell apart when people could read the Bible for themselves, and just like the Ottoman narrative crumbled when people could access European news, the official narrative in America is cracking as people access unfiltered information online. The pattern is identical. These alternative information networks expose the gap between the official story and reality. And when that gap becomes too wide to ignore, authority begins to dissolve. This leads us to the final act, stage 5, authority collapse and desperate information control. When these information monopolies realize they're losing their grip, they always react in the same predictable way. They make desperate attempts to suppress the alternative networks. They try to criminalize dissent, and they use force to try and restore the old system. The church tried everything. They banned printing in certain cities. They created the infamous Index of Forbidden Books. They launched the Inquisition to hunt down so-called heretics. They burned books, and sometimes, they burned the people who read them, but it didn't work. You can't uninvent the printing press. You can't force people to forget what they've already learned. By 1550, half of Northern Europe had left the Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation was simply unstoppable. The Ottomans tried similar tactics. They banned European newspapers. They restricted access to the telegraph. They arrested people for spreading what they called subversive information and tried to control their borders to stop the flow of news. But just like with the church, it was too little, too late. The lesson here is that once the information is out, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. History shows us that attempts to clamp down are a sign of weakness, not strength. It's the final, desperate move of a system that knows it has lost control of the narrative. Did you know that throughout history, major powers have collapsed in a surprisingly similar way? It all starts with information. Let's look at the Ottoman Empire. By 1900, they were facing a huge problem. Nationalist movements spread across their vast territories were using new communication networks like the telegraph to coordinate. The government just couldn't shut them down. These new networks exposed and strengthened ethnic and religious divides, and the empire started to break apart from the inside. Now, look at America today. We're seeing some familiar patterns, what you might call early stage 5 behavior. Social media platforms are censoring content, often under pressure from the government. Alternative news sources get slapped with the misinformation label. We're even seeing financial systems being used to silence dissenting voices. Governments are pushing new regulations to control online information, pressuring tech companies on content moderation, and using banking rules to defund media they don't like. But here's the thing. Just like you can't uninvent the printing press or the telegraph, you can't uninvent the internet. Every time a platform gets shut down, new ones pop up even faster. Decentralized technologies like cryptocurrency and blockchain are making financial censorship nearly impossible. The simple truth is, information wants to be free, and technology will always find a way to make that happen. The harder institutions try to clamp down and control the flow of information, the more it reveals they're actually losing control. This leads to the final stage, a complete collapse of authority. It's not a slow decline, it's a sudden implosion. Once people lose faith in the official story, they lose faith in the institution itself. Think about the Catholic Church's political power in Europe. After Martin Luther posted his theses in 1517, it took only about 50 years for that authority to crumble. Countries that had been Catholic for 1,000 years broke away. The Church kept its spiritual role for many, but its political control was gone forever. The Ottoman Empire's collapse was even quicker. From 1900 to 1920, it went from a massive empire spanning 3 continents to just ... not existing. World War I was the final push, but the information revolution was the real cause. The Sultan could hold onto power when his people had access to different ideas about what a nation could be, and the Soviet Union that was the fastest of all. In 1985, Gorbachev introduced glasnost, or openness. The government's monopoly on information cracked. Suddenly, Soviet citizens saw how far their economy had fallen behind, how much their leaders had lied, and how much better life was in the West. Within just 6 years, the superpower was gone. The pattern is always the same. First, the information monopoly breaks. Then, alternative networks rise up. This leads to a massive leak of information that contradicts the official narrative. The authorities try desperately to regain control, but their attempts fail. And finally, authority collapses, suddenly and completely. So, what does this pattern tell us about America's future? The timeline is remarkably consistent across different technologies and empires. From the moment alternative information networks reach a critical point, it takes about 15 to 25 years for the old authority to collapse. Let's look at the data. The printing press was invented around 1440. By 1517, with Luther's thesis, it hit critical mass. By 1550, Protestant territories were established. That's about 33 years. For the telegraph in the Ottoman Empire, it took about 44 years from critical mass to dissolution. For the Soviet Union, with TV and radio, it was about 31 years from the expansion of television to the final collapse. Now, the internet. Consumer internet started around 1995. By 2016, social media had clearly reached a political critical mass. If we follow the historical pattern that projects a collapse of the current authority structure between 2031 and 2040. But here's the catch. Modern technology speeds everything up. The printing press took decades to spread. The internet reached the entire globe in about 20 years. Information now spreads exponentially faster, which means the process of authority collapse should also happen faster. My estimate, America could reach a critical information breakdown around 2030 to 2035, with a full authority collapse by 2040 to 2045. That is just 15 to 20 years from now. This timeline makes a lot of sense when you think about generations. The generation born after the year 2000 gets most of its information from sources the government couldn't control. TikTok, YouTube, podcasts, Discord, encrypted messages. They don't trust mainstream media. They don't trust official government statements. By 2030, this generation will be in their 30s and 40s, reaching their peak political and economic influence. They will be the teachers, the managers, the local officials. They will control the local information networks that bypass the old federal authority. The shift is already happening, and history tells us what comes next. Think about the year 2040. The generation that's young today will be in their 40s and 50s. They'll be stepping into senior leadership roles across society, and they will have grown up knowing, or at least strongly suspecting, that the government isn't always straight with them on the big stuff: wars, the economy, surveillance, or environmental policy. This isn't a new phenomenon. This is the exact same pattern that eroded the Church's authority in Northern Europe, crumbled Ottoman rule in the Balkans, and brought down the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. What happens is, a generation comes of age with access to alternative sources of information. They reach political maturity and simply stop recognizing the old authority's legitimacy. It's a historical cycle, and it's happening again, right now. So, let's break down who wins and who loses when these massive information monopolies collapse. The winners are pretty clear. First, alternative information networks win big. Think about the printing shops during the Reformation, or the telegraph companies during the Ottoman decline. Today, it's the podcasters, YouTubers, Substack writers, and independent journalists. They are becoming the new authorities. A figure like Joe Rogan commands an audience that legacy media can only dream of. Independent researchers are often seen as more credible than university experts tied to institutional funding. Decentralized technologies also win. Things like cryptocurrency, blockchain, encrypted messaging apps, and peer-to-peer networks become the essential infrastructure. Why? Because people are actively fleeing centralized systems they no longer trust. They're looking for ways to communicate and transact outside the old guard's control. Interestingly, local and regional authorities also gain ground. As trust in federal or national government weakens, people naturally put more faith in the institutions closer to home. State and local governments become more powerful by comparison. This is just like how German princes gained influence during the Reformation, or how local governors asserted themselves as the Ottoman Empire waned. And of course, entrepreneurs and innovators win. Every information revolution creates a gold rush of opportunity for people who can build new systems, serve new needs, and adapt faster than the giants of the old world. Now for the losers. The federal government loses authority, not necessarily its raw power, but its moral authority, its legitimacy. People stop believing its statements, they stop voluntarily following its guidelines, and they start questioning its very right to rule. Mainstream media loses its audience and influence, probably for good, just as the church lost its position as Europe's primary information source centuries ago. Legacy media is losing its grip on the narrative today. Large institutions of all kinds take a hit. Universities, major corporations, big non-profits, any institution that relied on the old information monopoly for its credibility faces a permanent trust deficit. People who built their entire careers within that old system, government spokespeople, mainstream journalists, academic experts, they suddenly find their influence fading. Their authority was tied to a system that's becoming obsolete. But here's the most important point. This isn't about whether this is good or bad. It's simply inevitable. History shows us that information technology always wins. You cannot preserve an information monopoly once technology makes information abundant and cheap. The Catholic Church learned this the hard way in the 1500s. The Ottoman Empire learned it in the 1900s. The Soviet Union learned it in the 1990s. And the American establishment is learning it right now. And let me end with this thought. Every single information monopoly in history believed it was different. The Church believed divine authority made it permanent. The Ottomans believed their system was superior. The Soviets were certain their ideology was scientifically correct. Today's powers believe their system is too sophisticated, too embedded, and too powerful to be challenged. They think they can manage the flow of information through partnerships with tech companies, by manipulating algorithms, and by applying financial pressure. They are making the exact same mistake their predecessors made. They are trying to control the technology instead of adapting to the new reality it creates. The pattern is unfolding in 6 clear stages. Stage 1. The information monopoly is established. Check. Stage 2. It reaches peak control and overconfidence. Check. Stage 3. Alternative networks begin to emerge. Check. Stage 4. Mass information leaks become common. We are here now. Stage 5, which is just beginning, involves desperate attempts to regain control. And Stage 6, projected for the 2030s to 2040s, is the collapse of the old authority. For the past 600 years, every major empire has fallen in the same way, not through military conquest, not through economic collapse, but through an information revolution. Think about it. The printing press allowed ideas to spread outside the control of the Catholic Church, and it shattered their political authority. Then came the telegraph, which bypassed the slow, centralized communication of the Ottoman Empire, contributing to its fragmentation. Fast forward to the 20th century, and it was television and radio that showed people in the Soviet Union a world beyond their government's propaganda, ultimately leading to its dissolution. Today, the internet is doing the same thing to the authority of the American government and other Western powers. The pattern is always the same. When people gain access to unfiltered information, they begin to question the official stories they've been told. And when they stop believing those official narratives, the authority of the institutions telling them simply evaporates. This isn't a new phenomenon. It's a historical cycle that has repeated across continents and empires. Technology always wins. Information always seeks to be free. And any institution that tries to control the flow of information is destined to lose. The only real question is how long it will take. History suggests these shifts take about 15 to 20 years to fully play out. But with the speed of today's technology, it could happen much faster. We are literally about to watch the most powerful governments in history learn the exact same lesson that the Church, the Ottomans, and the Soviets learned the hard way. You cannot control information forever. Once you lose that control, you lose everything else. If this idea has opened your eyes to how history is repeating itself, you'll want to subscribe. Over the next few years, I'll be tracking every stage of this transformation, every attempt at censorship, every new decentralized platform that emerges, and every sign that we are accelerating towards a new era. The information revolution is happening, whether we are ready for it or not. The choice is yours. Will you understand what's unfolding as it happens, or will you just end up reading about it in the history books written by whoever comes next? Thanks for watching.